So since I've been doing this YouTube thing on this channel, you guys have been giving me information about the fact that the US have a law actually, that are required to be able to be ready to fight two wars at the same time. That means two wars on the west and from the east and west coast. And I think another fact I saw it. I think I saw one comment where someone also said US also have to have a particular number of aircraft carriers. So the title of this video is the real reason why US Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. So guys, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new here. Let's get right into it.
Aircraft carriers are so important to the US government that there is a federal law mandating the minimum number of operational carriers that the US Navy must have. That number is 11. But how did they come up with this number? And why is there so much emphasis on aircraft carriers and not on other types of ships? The number of aircraft carriers, the size of the US Navy, and the size of the US military as a whole all follow a simple formula that's based on two major wars. But it's not what you think. Being the most powerful is not the same thing as being powerful enough. You often hear that the United States has the largest and most powerful navy in the world, but just being number one is not necessarily sufficient. Just like how any MMA champion would be overwhelmed if they face multiple opponents at once, the most powerful military may also not be able to defeat the combined forces of multiple nations. So the question is, how much power is enough? The United States military doctrine is based around power projection. Power projection, simply put, is the ability of a country to deploy and sustain forces outside of their territory. To accommodate this, there are currently about 750 US foreign military bases spread across 80 nations around the world.
Crazy.
But the United States' primary means of power projection, especially where permanent basing is limited, is the Navy. And this is precisely why there is so much emphasis on aircraft carriers.
I mean, to be fair, I think the US copied the British Empire with this particular tactics. I know it seems original, but I think one of the reasons why the British Empire was so powerful during their heyday was because of the fact that they controlled the sea at that point. And I know that the sea is not as important as it was in the past. I know that, but ultimately, I still believe that sea is the most important. I think I had that question when I first started this channel, but all the videos I have watched so far, I'm beginning to come to that conclusion that sea is the most important, because from sea you can still launch your aircraft, your fighter jets from this aircraft carrier. So if you have enough navy, capability, you are able to actually put your jets on the ships, and you can just be able to launch it to enemy territory. So I think the sea is the most important thing, and I think the US copied the British Empire with this. And I'm not saying the British Empire were the first people to prioritize navy, but I think if you look at history, at least from what I know, the little I know, as you guys know, I'm still learning. I think the British Empire were the first powerful or superpower country at that point that actually really prioritized the sea. Like, they spent so much money in maintaining that Royal Navy. They spent so much money at that point during that period, and they were the most powerful because of that. They were able to control the whole world because of that power of the Navy.
Where is the closest aircraft carrier? They say that's the first question that US presidents ask at the time of a crisis. But it's really the air wing assigned to the aircraft carrier that the presidents are interested in. The carrier is just a floating airbase. The primary role of any aircraft carrier is to enable operation of the air wing that it carries. Kind of like how bread is just a vehicle for delivering butter. And the true power projection that aircraft carriers are known for is really enabled by the airplanes in the carrier air wing, which can project tactical air power over long distances, including airborne early warning, air interdiction, and air-to-surface warfare. In fact, the same law that currently demands the US Navy to have a minimum of 11 aircraft carriers also requires a minimum of 9 carrier air wings. But how did the US government come up with the number 11?
Yeah, I'd like to know.
The US Navy's 11 supercarriers are more than all other nations' aircraft carriers combined, and that's just in quantity. Displacement aside, the American aircraft carriers are all nuclear-powered, giving them unlimited range. But not all 11 supercarriers are deployable simultaneously. At any given time, about a third are in maintenance yards dealing with upgrades and overhauls, a third are undergoing training and preparation, and a third are on deployment. Even though, if needed, more carriers could be rushed into deployment, the total number of deployable supercarriers is far from the nominal 11. In practice, 2 to 3 supercarriers are deployed at any given time, and that is enough. Enough to fight 2 wars in 2 separate regions of the world at once and decisively win both.
Is 2 to 3 actually enough to fight both wars? I don't know. What do you guys think? I think that is too small to fight 2 wars. I mean, I can get it if it's only 1 war, but to fight 2 wars, and when I mean 2, I mean 2 different adversaries. That means with different vision and different plan, not the one that maybe they came together and one is in one side of the world and the other one is in the other side of the world. I mean, both adversaries just have different plans. So that means they're not fighting because they're friends. They're fighting because they have their own interest. So can the US actually fight that kind of war with only 2 ships or 3 ships? 3 aircraft carriers. I'm not sure about that.
Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the US Armed Forces were sized to be able to fight 2 wars at the same time. At some point, even a half war was added to be fought in the Third World. When Nixon took office in 1969, the formula was changed to accommodate fighting 1.5 wars simultaneously. Each president after that somewhat modified this strategy. But the basic measure still seems to be defined as the ability to fight in 2 geographically separated regions of the world nearly simultaneously. This is referred to as 2 major regional contingencies strategy or 2 major theater wars strategy. The ability to deter and defeat large-scale cross-border aggression in 2 distant theaters in overlapping timeframes is key for the United States to remain a global power and maintain its worldwide interests. The most recent example of this strategy in action is the 2 overlapping major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraq War started in 2003, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and the official withdrawal of US troops was completed in 2011. Although the mismanagement of the power vacuum following Saddam's demise gave prominence to ISIS in 2014, followed by the re-involvement of US troops. In parallel, the war in Afghanistan started in 2001 and went on for 20 years. In February of 2020, the US and Taliban signed an agreement in Qatar, where Taliban agreed to take unspecified action to prevent...
Wait. I thought... It's not just a few months ago that I was hearing complaints from the US government about how the Taliban are treating women. Wait. I actually thought that the US left Afghanistan because of the fact that maybe they have spent so much money and they have not really achieved much. So I think maybe it was some kind of a political move by Biden. That's what I was thinking. I never knew they actually signed an agreement. They actually did sign an agreement. So in that part of the agreement, couldn't they have mentioned, dude, these women that we have liberated, I hope you don't put them back into chains. Didn't they think about that? Seriously, like, I was hearing the news, I think that was late last year, where there were some controversy about the fact that the Taliban were not allowing women to go to girls to go to school anymore. I mean, what were you expecting? So I actually thought maybe just because of the fact that the US left, so they left a vacuum there, obviously. And I thought maybe, okay, the Taliban were not doing what they normally do. But the fact that they actually signed an agreement and they did not state that, to insist that, look, I don't even know. Like, the whole thing is very complex. It's just very shocking to me because the US, I saw a lot of videos of US government personnel complaining about this, Taliban, these Afghanistan girls not being able to go to school again because of the Taliban. But they signed an agreement with them. I mean, it makes no sense to me, but whatever.
other groups, including Al-Qaeda, from using Afghan soil to threaten the US and its allies, in return for full withdrawal of all international forces from Afghanistan. By August 31, 2021, as the whole world was watching, the US and allied forces had hastily departed from Kabul, putting the Taliban back in control of the country. But this idea of fighting two wars at once goes back to the late 19th and early 20th century. The late 19th century was a time of territorial expansion for the United States. In 1898 alone, the United States annexed Hawaii, acquired Guam and Puerto Rico, and purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. With some of those islands being in the Pacific and the rest in the Atlantic, Navy presence was required in both oceans. The completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 allowed the crossing of ships from one side to the other, which meant the US Navy could be present in both oceans without having twice as many ships. But by the 1930s, with the rise of new regional powers to the west and the decline of the Royal Navy to protect the United States against threats from the east, it became necessary for defense planners to consider the possibility of confronting two threats simultaneously, from Germany on the east and from Japan on the west. The result was the 1940 Vincent Walsh Act, also known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which funded a 70% increase in the size of the US Navy fleet. This was the largest naval procurement bill in US history, authorizing $8.5 billion at the time for a naval expansion program that put emphasis on aircraft and aircraft carriers. This resulted in the construction of 18 aircraft carriers and expansion of air and naval facilities across the Pacific. Now, it's one thing to come up with a concept or strategy, like one that allows for fighting and winning two major wars simultaneously. But it's a whole other thing to actually come up with the numbers. How many Army divisions, how many Air Force fighter wings, and how many Navy carrier strike groups are required to support such a strategy? And within each one, say the Navy, how many and what types of ships are exactly needed? The US Navy's goal is to reach 355 ships by 2034.
What?
Currently, they have 298.
Oh, okay. I thought it was aircraft carriers. Okay, so yeah, okay. Not all ships are aircraft carriers. Okay, I get that.
Retiring two-year-old ships, it's debatable that they'll hit that goal. Remember that aircraft carriers are vulnerable on their own, which is why they never sail alone. A variety of ships are needed to support the carriers when deployed, which is why Navy ships like cruisers, destroyers, and at times submarines and supply ships accompany carriers in a formation known as a carrier strike group. But conservative public policy organizations, notably studies done by the Heritage Foundation, call for a much bigger military. For example, not a 355-ship Navy, but a 400-ship Navy. And not 11 aircraft carriers, but 13. 12 plus 1.
What's the difference?
The one accounts for a carrier that is almost always undergoing extensive midlife overhaul. The rationale for wanting the other 12 aircraft carriers is to maintain one aircraft carrier at each of the three major regions of the world: Atlantic, Pacific, and the Mediterranean/Middle East. Then to have 3 additional aircraft carriers for each carrier deployed. This is to ensure that the ships, the crew, and the aircraft on board can remain healthy and effective. Less ships could mean longer deployment times, which may not be operationally realistic. The 340-day deployment of USS Nimitz, which ended in March of 2021, was the longest deployment of any aircraft carrier since the Vietnam War. Even though the proponents of the two major theater wars strategy insist that no one has been able to come up with a better and more robust solution for sizing the US military, there are massive costs associated with maintaining and growing an even bigger military force, something that has proven difficult given that US military budget as a percentage of the GDP has been declining over the past few decades. In addition, other forms of threats like cyber warfare could throw a big wrench into the mix. Cyber attacks that can cause widespread disruption to communication systems in the United States, or even worse, in military command, control, and communication systems could have devastating consequences to U.S. national security. The Two-Navy Act of 1940 was written at a time when power projection required physical presence, aircraft carriers, and aviators. That's why we love Top Gun. But would a day come when Tom Cruise stars in Top Hack?
Top Hack. Oh man, Top Hack. I think what the US is doing is understandable, power projection and all that. But I think at the end of the day, if they were ever to start a war with any of these nuclear-powered countries, it will just go to nuclear bombs. I'm not sure countries are going to use conventional means. If it ever came to real war, not just this proxy war that is happening in Ukraine right now. I mean a real war. Like, let me say the US declares war on Russia or Russia declares war on the US. I don't think it's going to involve aircraft carriers and all that. It's just going to be a bunch of tapping some buttons from the whatever nuclear football, whatever. And that is all that is going to be. At the end of the day, right now, the US can, bully all these other smaller countries with their military might and all that. But there's a reason why they have not invaded North Korea. Despite the fact that they complain about North Korea every day. They have not invaded North Korea. Yeah, the US can wipe out North Korea by tomorrow if they wanted. But can they take the risk of North Korea dropping one nuclear bomb on New York City or Los Angeles? I don't think so. They can't take that risk. So they cannot just invade North Korea just like that, except if it came to like a life and death situation where they had no choice. But if it's just like, this guy is just oppressing his people, all the US can do is just to sanction them. They can't invade, really. They can't. The same thing with Ukraine. If Ukraine had those nuclear weapons that they gave up in the 90s, I think they gave up in the 90s. If they still had this, I don't think Russia would have invaded them. I don't think so. So at the end of the day, all these things is fine. It's good. It's good to project the power, and I think that is part of the reason why the US spend all this money. But ultimately, if it ever came to a point where it comes to a head, I think countries are just going to go and start